Morning glory and evening grace, America. Hugh Hewitt in Studio West on a day of great market turbulence. I want to talk about something other than that. I want to talk with Douglas Murray, author of this brand new book on democracies and death cults. It's really quite profound. The subtitle tells you everything: Israel and the Future of Civilization. Douglas Murray is a writer and an author for the New York Post and the Free Press, and he joins me. Congratulations, Douglas. This is quite the book. I hope it's being received well outside of the world of the fanatics and the killers who must not like it at all.
Well, it's very good to be with you, Hugh. I'm a great admirer of the show and a great listener to you, and it's wonderful to be on. Yes, I actually launched the book at Columbia University on Friday of last week. And that was obviously very deliberate and pointed, but it was actually a rather wonderful occasion. As you know, President Trump has threatened to withdraw federal funding from colleges like Columbia, which have allowed supporters of the death cults of Hamas to just parade around university freely for the last 18 months, chanting anti-Americanism, anti-Israel activity, chasing Jewish students across campus, and much more. But it's rather wonderful, I have to say, to speak to some of the good students and professors at Columbia. You'll notice, I'm sure as I have, that in the last year and a half, all the people in our country here in America who support Hamas simultaneously wear kafirs and other bits of Palestinian terrorist chic, and also pretend to be very scared of the COVID-19 virus because they're always masked up. They always hide themselves wherever they can. And that's because I think they know that they're doing something deeply shameful. And then most of them are actually, to some extent, I think, embarrassed by it. There are some fanatics who aren't, but there are many who realize that perhaps it's not the best look to be on the side of rapists and murderers and beheaders and kidnappers and much more.
I am hopeful that On Democracies and Death Cults actually advances the argument with the students. At one point towards the close of the book, you ask rhetorically, what will it take for these students to realize it's not a game? But let me begin with your very first line. Sometimes a flare goes up and you get to see exactly where everyone is standing. It's a beautiful line. You also get to see who's a giant and who's a hero, and you get to see the orcs and the demons. You spend a lot of time on both the evil and the good. I want to start with Ben Shimoni, because of all of the extraordinary stories that are interspersed throughout the arc of your point, his really hit me. He was at the Nova party. He drove out twice. He saved 9 people. He went back a third time. He talked to his girlfriend, Jessica Miranda Elter. He said he would come back. He got 9 out alive. He did not come back. The killers got him and other passengers in his car. Did his girlfriend speak with you? Did any of the 9 that he saved speak with you?
Yes. I spoke to his girlfriend and other survivors. This book, I say, if I'd have included all the stories of heroism and just incredible bravery that I've heard in the last 18 months in Israel, it would have been 100 times the length. But yes, that story is incredibly moving to me, because it's an example of the fact that there's a young man who risked his life not once or twice, but 3 times to get other young people of his age out from this moment when the terrorists went into the Nova music party, the dance party, in the early hours of the morning. Was just an unimaginable to most of us act of savagery. They raped people, they murdered, mutilated, tortured, and kidnapped. And here is just one story, but one of the most moving to me, of somebody who knew that he could save lives in the middle of this moment when Hamas were intent on taking so many young lives, and did. And he went back again and again to save lives. And, as you say, it's very important to focus on the evil that was done that day. But I think it's also important to focus on the good and the unbelievably heroic good that some people did.
And the poignancy. Another story you toss in is that Omar Ohana and Sagi Golan were to be married in 2 weeks, but both men were immediately recalled to the units. They both went, they stayed in touch, but one did not survive. Sagi died. And every leader, I'm not familiar with his music, was supposed to sing at their wedding. He sang at the funeral of Sog. I find that, I mean, there are 1,200 dead, 5,000 wounded, tens of thousands of family members. You could do stories forever. So obviously, the writer's dilemma here is which ones do you use, Douglas Murray?
Yes. Well, I've tried to show in the round really what it was like when just absolute horror, absolute evil descended that morning, and it's extremely hard to select stories from that. But I wanted to kind of epitomize to whatever extent I can as a writer the events of that terrible day and then the results afterwards. But I think that it's incredibly important, this when you're describing events is horrific. It's also so important it's to bring not just the magnitude of it, but also the human reality of it home. Sometimes with an atrocity like this, we throw out numbers, and that's important, but every number is a name, is a person, is a story of its own. And as I say, I could have gone on forever with the horrors, but also could have gone on forever with some of the heroism, which I recount, and I do it in part not just to provide a historically accurate account of part of that day, but to pose this question to the rest of us in the West, because it's a question I've been mulling on for the last 18 months, and indeed for most of my adult life, is what do you do? What can be done in the face of people who, like Al Qaeda, like ISIS, and others, taunt us with their love of death, their desire for death, their longing for death? And what do we do with a group that, like Hassan Nasrallah, the late leader of Hezbollah, said in many years ago? He said in a speech, our enemies, the Westerners, the Americans, the Israelis, he said they love life and this is their weakness. And we can take advantage of that weakness because we love death. But as
Yeah.
I say in the book, there is an answer to that. And it's exemplified not least in some of the extraordinary heroes I interviewed for this book.
Now, I'll tell the audience, I read it in two sittings on Friday and Sunday. Took a day off in between to think about it. And the arc of the book seemed to me to begin with the utter awful horror and then to build towards a hopeful ending about whether or not
Mm.
the West can rally around the love of life and living life fully to defeat the cult of death. But there are a couple of lessons along the way. I want to go to the first one. Hubris was the great enemy of Israel. And you mentioned Fauda. You also mentioned the Iron Dome. I love the scene with the old guy slamming the vodka down, say yes or no. Iron Dome is a good idea. It's a disease that America might have too. We don't think that Pearl Harbor can happen to us again when in fact it can. We imagine ourselves sort of distanced from all this stuff even after 9/11. Do you think the Israelis are over hubris for a long time, if not ever?
I think they certainly were before the 7th, for sure, and before 6:30 a.m. on the 7th, when the first missiles started to come through, thousands of missiles fired from Gaza into Israel. I think there was, I mean, undoubtedly, the country was caught sleeping. It was the 50th anniversary of the surprise invasion of the Yom Kippur War, and so you might think, well, focus on these anniversaries, remember it, but 50 years, a half a century, is a sort of it's such a long time in the Western mindset. It's not a long time in the jihadist or death cult mindset, but it is in ours. And if you look at what Israel was doing in the year before the 7th, the country, it's almost biblical. The country was tearing itself apart over an issue of judicial reforms that some people think are necessary, some people are very critical of. Lots of Israelis were out on the streets of Tel Aviv every weekend protesting against the government's reforms. I quote in the book one man who said to me, ironically and darkly, he said, Hamas were stupid. If they'd left us a few more months, we'd have all killed each other. But they were, as I say, it's almost biblical. It is biblical that the nation was so divided and it was tearing itself apart. And then the horror descended, and it reminded everybody of what is actually out there and what matters. But yes, I mean, demonstrably, obviously, provably, on the morning, Israel was unprepared for an attack of this scale, sophistication, and brutality. And I hope that it doesn't lose the memory of that, and I don't think it will.
Now, the difference between 9/11 and 10/7 is Americans could tell themselves that everyone was in caves in Afghanistan and 19 people got through and only 19. On 10/7, thousands of people came through the fence. Many of them were Hamas terrorists, other of them were civilian killers, but thousands of them. And you try and trace the bacillus of Nazism to the Grand Mufti. Now, on this program, this audience has heard a lot about the Grand Mufti because Larry Arnn, president of Hillsdale College, has frequently mentioned his relationship with Hitler and how Churchill understood that. He got away to Egypt and he passed this bacillus on. Do you think
Yeah.
Americans quite understand that this is a fusion of religious fanaticism and it's just Nazi ideology 2.0?
It's not just Americans. Nobody in the world really understands this. Even in the Middle East, even in Israel, many people don't, I think, understand this particular corner of it. Which is that, as I say in the book, that one of the things about what happened in 1945 and the defeat of Nazism was that Nazism and Nazi anti-Semitism was comprehensively defeated in two ways. It was defeated on the battlefield, but it was also shown to be utterly, utterly defeated in the realm of ideas. In other words, at the end of the war, the people who had fueled this toxic anti-Semitism, and as everyone knows, the thing with anti-Semitism is that it shows up the weakness across the rest of society. Once you start getting into anti-Semitic conspiracies, everything else follows. It's a sign of societal breakdown. And when the war ended in 45, the people who had fueled that virus in Germany, in Nazi Germany, and across the continent, they were either tried and hanged or tried and imprisoned. And the ones who escaped scuttled like rats out of Europe and hid under false names in South America. In other words, it was defeated. There is one corner of this that, as I say in the book, people really need to realize, which is that the one place in the world where somebody who was part of that Nazi anti-Semitic ideology returned home and was welcomed openly as a victor and a hero was the Muslim world, the Arab world. When the Grand Mufti gets back to Egypt in 1946, Egyptian public radio welcomes him. And they say, this is a man who set up his own SS unit, went to Adolf Hitler, as you and your listeners know, and said, I want to set up my own SS group to clear the Jews out of the Middle East. This man who did that returns home to Egypt in 1946, and Egyptian public radio says, the scourge of the Jews, the lion of the Muslims has returned to us. And very often in recent years, I've wondered, why is it the case that the one place in the world where, Mein Kampf is routinely found in bookshops, and not as a historical artifact, but as a kind of to-do manual for today, is in the Arab and Muslim world? Why is it the case? Why is it the case that so many of the soldiers coming out of Gaza and the IDF just daily find anti-Semitic Nazi filth in house after house? And it's because this is the one place in the world where this vicious strain of ideology still lives. And I believe that until that is defeated as well, there is no prospect of peace any more than there would have been if, worship of the emperor and the death cult of the emperor's followers in imperial Japan had existed after 1945. It's not enough for an ideology to simply be defeated on the battlefield. It has to also happen in the realm of ideas. In the Middle East, unfortunately, in the Muslim world, to a great extent, this bacillus, this virus, still thrives.
There is quite a lot of reflection on what the anti-Semitism of the moment means. And you borrow from Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate. I want to read that quote. Anti-Semitism is always a means rather than an end. It is a measure of the contradictions yet to be resolved. It is the mirror for the failings of the individual social structures and state systems. Tell me, he wrote, what you accuse the Jews of, and I'll tell you what you are guilty of. You update that and edit slightly, saying, tell me what you accuse the Jews of, and I'll tell you what you believe you are guilty of. Does that apply to those students at Columbia, at Harvard, at Michigan, at UCLA, everywhere across the United States?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'll just quickly. Grossman's brilliant insight about this is absolutely applicable today across the Middle East. Look at the Iranian revolutionary government in Tehran. It accuses Israel of being a colonialist, expansionist state. The mullahs in Tehran since 1979, when they seized control of that great country and ran it into the ground, have been colonizing not just Iran, they've been colonizing Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. So when they accuse the Jewish state of colonialism, it is they who are the colonialists in the region. The president of Turkey, Mr. Erdogan, often refers to the colonization that he accuses Israel of, and he accuses Israel of being an occupying power. President Erdogan is the president of Turkey, which currently occupies half of Cyprus. They have occupied it for 50 years now, illegally occupying half of an EU member state whilst being in NATO themselves. So when Mr. Erdogan says that the Israelis are occupiers, he's telling us what he is. He's telling us what he is. Now, how this applies to the student protesters and others in America is something I put a lot of thought into, because in my last book, The War on the West, I wrote about this anti-American virus that had been caught in the last generation in this country, and how people, particularly at the most privileged institutions, were spreading this idea that America was just this terrible idea, that America was uniquely guilty, that America was guilty of colonialism, white supremacy, racism, slavery, and so on. They had turned into an entirely anti-Western and anti-American view of the world. And in the last 18 months, as I saw from the 7th of October onwards, as I saw here in New York on the 8th of October, where protesters in Times Square were praising the massacres of Hamas that Hamas were doing as they were going on. What I saw was these people were all accusing Israel of occupation, colonialism, genocide, white supremacy, and so on. And I thought, well, this is interesting, because this seems to me to be a version of what a psychologist would describe as projection. These students have been told, and I wondered in the War in the West what would happen with this. They've been told they, by dint of being in America in the 21st century, are guilty of these alleged crimes of America in the past, some of which nobody disputes, slavery, for instance, some of which genocide and ethnic cleansing and so on are eminently disputable. But they've been told that these are all the story of America, and they, by being Americans, are guilty of them by descent. And I said in the War on the West, this is a very dangerous position, because nobody in question is guilty, and there's no one around who can accept an apology. Nobody alive either perpetrated or suffered any of these crimes, where the crimes are true. So what you see in the last 18 months is certain types of students in America who believe that they can expiate the guilt they've been told they should feel by attacking Israel in the here and now for all of these things that they themselves have been told that they're guilty of. And this is a very dangerous situation, but it undoubtedly fuels this fervent, hate-filled movement, which is so disturbing and should be so disturbing to Americans everywhere.
Well, there are 4 pages of statistics in your new book, and again, I want people to get out and get on democracies and death cults about what students believe. And I wrote in my margin note, we are living in an age of stupidity. I mean, just really genuine historical illiteracy that I don't know if we can remedy. Do you think it can be remedied? Because most of these students, and I use students with air quotes, are unaware of even basic history. And
Yeah.
Habib Reddy-Gore likes to speak about that, but they're not going to listen to Habib. They might listen to you. They might listen to me. Probably you. You're younger. But I don't know that you can undo the damage of an education system that left out. You can't put in what God left out as a line from Chariots of Fire. I don't know we can put in basic literacy to these people. Do you think we can?
I think it is possible. I'm certainly not hopeless about it. And that's partly because I think that there are very, very smart young Americans coming up, many of whom I've spoken to in recent years, who have seen through this horrible system that has been pushed on them. But it's not going to be done overnight. I'm very positive about the Trump administration's threats to withdraw federal funding for many of these universities, and I think there's an obvious place to start. As I said to the students at Columbia the other day, anything with studies in the name should almost certainly be defunded. There is no need for post-colonial studies. In fact, there's no need for Middle East studies at American universities. None of the students who study these so-called studies are really being educated in the round at all. They're being made into activists. They're being persuaded that the best use of time is to run up large amounts of debt in order to be expensively made into an illiterate who also believes some rather wicked things. And I don't think that's the best use of taxpayer dollars, to put it at its mildest. I think it can be turned around, but all these departments across university after university that have actually stated that they want to create activists, this is not what universities are for. They're not meant to be radicalization centers in which people are churned out believing that they can solve a problem they know almost nothing about. And by the way, look at I said this Columbia the other day. Look at the very way that a lot of these students who have been radicalized try to communicate. They don't communicate like you and I are communicating now. They don't exchange ideas. They don't swap ideas and try things out. They stand outside and they chant the same thing repeatedly: intifada, intifada, things like that. And when somebody does that, they are doing the opposite of what a university is for. Because at university, you're meant to exchange ideas, you're meant to learn, and and that's done by talking and by reading and by listening. But the opposite of that is chanting, because chanting is an attempt not to persuade somebody. Nobody says, "Oh, the 20th time you've called for an intifada,
Ha!
I agree. Yeah, I didn't get it the first 19 times." Nobody says that. The point of the chanting is not to persuade, it's to intimidate and to browbeat. It's to make you acquiesce in their demands. That is an anti education movement, and it should be identified as such. And I'm very happy if those departments that have encouraged that kind of non communication go to the dust.
I want to ask you because you've had a lot of experience with the fanatics, Douglas Murray, and I've seen you on BBC take apart some of the stupid people. In the United States, speech is protected by the Brandenburg test. I've been teaching con law for almost 30 years. And for speech to be punishable, it has to not only have the explicit purpose of causing violence, but have the present ability to do so. It seems to me a lot of the pro evil demonstrations past that line in the sand, but we have not yet resolved to end those kinds of speeches by denying them the parade permits that they need, even though it often ends up in violence. Do you think we ought to
Mm.
go in that direction?
You know, as listeners can tell, I'm from Britain, and there's a different standard in the UK. There are laws, for instance, against the glorification of terrorism. That said, those laws are not followed. The police all too rarely actually go for people guilty of that. They can They can arrest housewives for writing something critical of the police on Instagram and so on. But many of the people who are actually terrorist supporters get away with it. Of course, there's a different standard in the US, but I've been rather struck by some of the debate in this on this in recent weeks, because it seems to me there's several things, and you know this much better than I do. But the first thing is that, of course, the protections that an American citizen has are different from the protections that somebody, for instance, coming to the US on a green card or a visa has.
Correct.
And I think that Secretary Rubio was absolutely right the other week when he said in a press conference, you know, if you've come to the United States and you've pretended to us you're coming to study, but actually you spend your time inciting violence on campus and saying you want to overthrow the government and the system of the country you're in, maybe America doesn't really need you here. Maybe you should use your talents back in your home country to stir up the dissent there. And I think a lot of people in recent weeks have failed to realize the difference between those two things. If I went to study in France and used my time not to study, but to call for the complete overthrow of the French government and the French system and the Western system as a whole, I'd be surprised if the French remained very welcoming to me. Um, and so I think that just a sane society doesn't need to import lots more people who want to overthrow the society. So I think there is a different speech standard there. The second thing I'd say about this is, and I said this to somebody I was debating the other day rather vociferously on this, the podcaster Andrew Sullivan. I said to him, when he and others have been very vocal about how terrible they think it is that one of the organizers of the Columbia demonstrations, whose organization said that their aim is the complete destruction of Western civilization, when he was detained by ICE, and he's going to go through due process. He's due to go to a court in New Jersey to see whether or not he broke the rules of his green card and so on. I I'm keen that people have that debate, and I think that it's useful and fruitful. But I would be much more interested in it if the people making such a free speech hero of him talked more about, for instance, 21-year-old Eden Alexander from New Jersey, coincidentally, who has spent the last 18 months actually in captivity, actually kidnapped, tortured, held hostage, denied every right by Hamas in Gaza, where they have held him for the last 18 months as a hostage. And all the people who are leaping out to defend the pro Hamas people, I wish that they had spent any of the last 18 months talking about Americans and others who were actually kidnapped, have actually been detained, and had all of their rights withdrawn. And I can't help noticing the unbelievable double standard that people are exercising here.
Douglas Murray, one of the amazing parts of the book is that you retrace the steps of Yahya Sinwar as he dies, and you enter into Rafah, and you are not disguising the destruction that is everywhere and 360 degrees all around you. Do you think if you could have questioned Sinwar, he would have thought it was worth it? Because and is this scale of destruction and defeat going to set back the bacillus significantly in your view?
Sinwar, who was, of course, as you know, the planner of the 7th of October massacres, was eventually tracked down and killed in under a year after October the 7th. And yes, I spent a lot of time in Gaza, Lebanon, as well as Israel in the last year and a half researching this. I was embedded with the IDF and saw a lot, let's just say. After the death of Sinwar, after he was eventually found and killed, I went in actually with the battalion who'd found him. And the only reason he cropped up in Rafah, right in the south of Gaza, was because he had nowhere else to run. And that was a result of very hard fighting by the young men and women of the IDF through Gaza, often house to house, against this terrorist army that, as everyone knows, embeds themselves in civilian buildings, dresses in civilian clothes, and flouts every rule of war. Um, After a year, there was nowhere else for Sinwar to run. It's a very interesting thing. I spoke at one of the reunions of the Nova Party survivors. I spoke to a very brilliant woman who was a therapist who was working with some of the survivors who, understandably, suffering from uh, post-traumatic stress disorder and much more. And this woman said to me when I was describing some of the Hamas as psychopaths, she said, "Remember, Douglas, that there's a difference between a psychopath and a sociopath." She said, in the trade, it's believed that psychopaths are probably born, but sociopaths are made. Now,
Huh.
Sinwar was almost certainly a psychopath. He was in Israeli jails in the 2000s for throttling to death Palestinians with his own hands. He was a bloody killer and almost certainly a psychopath. But what he did in the years after he was released from Israeli prisons and planned the seventh and killed many Palestinians as well as Israelis, what he did was that he helped create a generation of sociopaths in Gaza. Hamas, remember, had 18 years to govern the Gaza. 18 years. That is the time from, as I say in the book, the birth of a child to the end of their formal education. The Hamas could have done anything in that time. They could have brought up a new generation of Gazans to live beside their Israeli neighbors and have the same dream that so many of the Israelis massacred on the 7th had, which was to live in peace with their neighbors. They could have done that. They could have created a thriving state. They could have not used the outside investment from American taxpayers, European taxpayers, and others to loot the money and make themselves multi billionaires. They could have not used the money to build underground tunnel systems throughout the Gaza. They could have used it to actually grow and make the state they'd been given, but they didn't. Sinwar and the other leaders of Hamas wanted to create a generation of sociopaths in Gaza. And I believe to a very considerable extent they survived. That's one of the reasons why I haven't spoken to one hostage who's been released in the exchanges in the releases of hostages that have been accomplished in the last year. I haven't spoken to one hostage who said that they had any kindness from anyone in Gaza they came across. From the moment that the footage that we see of young women being dragged, having been raped, being dragged through the Gaza with cheering Gazans around the place, cheering on the rapists and the murderers with such glee. From then to the accounts of hostages, a couple of them managed to escape, were immediately returned to captivity by Gazans they stumbled upon. This is a very sick society that Hamas created, and it is not going to be solved easily. But there are ways to solve it. There are ways to answer this, and I believe, at the very least, that there is a punishment for repeatedly starting wars to try to annihilate your neighbors and failing to try to live in peace with them.
That punishment and that solution would require resolve on the part of not just Israel, but its allies, including us. And we have a memory problem. I've got here a badge I keep on my desk of J.P. Blecksmith, who was killed in Fallujah in 2004, in 2003, excuse me, the first Battle of Fallujah. We've forgotten Fallujah. Now it's almost there's a phenomenon in medical terms, global transient amnesia, where for a short
Mm.
period of time, a couple of days, someone can't make short term memory. They know who they are, but they can't remember what they were doing when the phenomenon overloaded their brains. We're giving money to Gaza right now. We're giving money we haven't discontinued UNRWA. We're not, and I'm not sure that the West has the ability to make short term memory about its enemies. Do you think we've got that ability? Remember who really wants to kill us?
A great historian of the Islamic world some years ago said that if there was one thing he wished that people in the West understood, it was that we think in America and the rest of the West, at longest, we think of 4-year electoral cycles, presidential terms. Mostly we think about 2-year cycles. And in fact, we generally these days get caught on 24-hour news cycles. But as he said, the smallest element of time, the smallest version of time that the Islamic world thinks in is decades. And I think that this is a great strength in a way of the extremists within the Islamic world. And it is a considerable weakness of ours, but it's not one that we have to always be weak on. We just have to have a better memory and a better long-term thinking. I'm actually, this is one of the reasons why when President Trump, the other week said that he believed that the Gazan population could be encouraged to leave whilst it's being rebuilt, perhaps stay out, perhaps come back. He wasn't talking about forcing people out, but if people want to leave, perhaps they can leave. I was quite enthusiastic about that because the only paradigm, the only plan anyone seemed to have until then was that the international community pours billions into Gaza again to rebuild it, and probably the same thing will happen in a few years' time. Um, the Islamic world, of course, does believe that much of it believes, certainly the extremists believe, that anything they own, they have to keep forever. Anything they ran, they get to run forever. I think that part of what is interesting about President Trump's suggestion is that it plays that back at them, which is if you try to fight and annihilate your neighbors and you lose, we might take land from you. You might suffer land loss. That is the kind of language that some of the people in the region do understand. It's just it's not a language which the West is any longer able to do. But personally speaking, I'm not willing to give up the idea, the principle indeed, that if, as I say, you keep making your country's people invade your neighbors and try to annihilate them and wipe them out and carry out genocide, actual genocide against them, that if you keep doing that, at some point you lose the right to be running that country.
Penultimate question, Douglas Murray, that comes out of a couple of sections of On Democracies and Death Cults. And again, I recommend the audience go out and get it today. Hanaya, the political leader of Hamas, is eventually killed in Iran by Israel. But when his 4 sons and 4 grandchildren died simultaneously, you describe his reaction as almost joy. And you contrast it with a friend of Gadi Eisenkot, a retired IDF, a member of the interwar cabinet for a long period of time. And the friend went to Gadi's son's bar mitzvah, and it's just grief. It's, I think C.S. Lewis said if you could see grief, the world would be covered in black. Israel certainly would be covered in black for a long period of time. How can you possibly win when when you put a Hanaya's fanaticism against an Eisenkot's grief?
It's a very important question. It's one I've been mulling on for a long time. Um, I say toward the end of the book that this chant that the jihadists use, the Nasrallahs, ISIS, Hamas, we love death more than you love life. This chant seemed to me for many, many years to be an almost impossible thing to reply to. When they say the Westerners, the Americans, the Israelis, they love life and we'll use that against them. One of the things I came to realize in my period covering this war, as well as wars elsewhere, is that we can actually look at this another way. And it's the way that I think that Israel has shown in the last year and a half, which is to say, you know what? Yes, we do love life. We do. We do not celebrate when our children die. We don't celebrate when other people's children die. We mourn because we love life. But because we love life does not mean we will not fight for it. And what I have seen up close in the last 18 months is a country at the forefront of that fight. A country that knows that if you are going to have the right to dance in Tel Aviv and to marry and to start a family and everything, you also have to be willing on occasion to fight for it. The young generation in Israel, in my observation, have shown themselves to be magnificent in rising to that moment. And as I say, I think the rest of us, America, Britain, if we ever came again to a time of trial like that, we have a lot to learn, because what Israel has faced in the last year and a half is a cult of death. But they have responded to it, not just forcefully on the battlefield, but also in demonstrating that you can fight and you can still love and celebrate life.
So my last question, Douglas Murray, is about you. You write at the end of the book, you've been prone to a very unusual bit of optimism. People who know you say, "My, you're not as pessimistic as you usually are." Over the long time I've been doing this show, I've talked to a lot of war correspondents, Dexter Filkins, John Fisher Burns, a lot of people, Tom Ricks, who spent a lot of time around horrible things. And you saw the movie, I won't see the movie. For example, the opportunity's been offered to me. I tell them I'm too old to see that. I won't sleep again. Do
You're
you
right.
intend to keep doing this? Because it's got to take a toll to do this. I'm glad you were there because the Israelis and American Jews tend to talk to each other and not to the Gentiles. You're a Gentile, I'm a Gentile. We cover Israel a lot. But I'm glad you're there and doing it. I also worry, though, about what the toll is long term of doing this again and again and again and again.
Uh, I don't know. I mean, all I know is that I think as a writer, your job is to see as much of the truth as you can and to report back. And that's what I've tried to do. I've tried to do that with my reporting from Ukraine as well, and I've certainly tried to do that in this book. I quote at the beginning of the book again that great Soviet writer Vasily Grossman, where he said somewhere, he said, you might ask, what's the point of dwelling on these things? What's the point of saying these things? And he said it's the job of the writer to report back, and it's the job of the civilian reader to know it. Um, I believe that although I've seen plenty of horror, it's also been, as I say, my enormous honor to see people fighting for life, to see life continue, to see it thrive, for people to marry, to begin their lives, to fall in love, and much more in the face of what sometimes seems like overwhelming hate. But as I say, sometimes it is the case that the darkness seems very, very overwhelming. But I've come to the conclusion that it can be absolutely shattered by a single ray of light. And I've had the great honor of seeing many rays of light in the last 18 months.
Well, thank you for spending this much time with me. On Democracies and Death Cults is in bookstores everywhere, available at Amazon and doing very well there. And I hope it sells and sells and sells and people take it to heart. Douglas Murray, come back. Good to see you and thank you.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure.